On a remote stretch of lake nestled deep in the woods, there stood an old, decrepit lake house. It had been abandoned for years, the paint chipped, the windows fogged over with time, and the once pristine dock now rotted and barely hanging on at the water's edge. A group of friends, eager to escape their hectic lives and get away for a weekend of relaxation, had rented the lake house. They were unaware that what awaited them would be more horrifying than they could ever imagine. The first night seemed uneventful. They unpacked, enjoyed a quiet dinner, and laughed over a few drinks. The lake was still and calm, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. But as the evening progressed, the air grew heavy, and an eerie unease settled over the house. The silence outside the lake house was absolute, almost unnatural. There were no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, no sounds of animals or birds. Just stillness. It was when they went to bed that things began to take a darker turn. One of them, Sarah, woke up to the faint sound of scraping on the window. She thought it was the wind, or perhaps the branches of a tree brushing against the glass, but the noise persisted. She lay frozen, heart racing, as the scratching grew louder, like something or someone was desperately trying to get in. She quietly got out of bed and crept toward the window, her hands shaking as she pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there, just the dark, still water of the lake, reflecting the pale light of the moon. She brushed it off, but the unease remained, gnawing at the back of her mind. The next day, things only worsened. As the group ventured out to explore, they came across a small, dilapidated boathouse further down the shore. The door was slightly ajar, and an overpowering sense of dread washed over them as they stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with decay. Old fishing nets hung like cobwebs, and the walls were covered in mildew. But it was the sight of something strange that caught their attention. On the far wall was a series of old, faded photographs of the lake house, the surrounding woods, and a family. But what made them shiver was the fact that the faces of the people in the photos were scratched out, as if someone was trying to erase them from existence. The group hurried back to the house, dismissing the boathouse as just another odd relic of the past. But as they entered the lake house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind rattling the shutters, felt like a warning. That night, the terror began. They were sitting around the fireplace when the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their phones, trying to find any source of light. The temperature in the house dropped sharply, their breath fogging in the air. Then, out of the silence, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the shadows, "Get out!" It came from the direction of the kitchen, but when they rushed to check, the room was empty. The door to the cellar, however, was wide open. The air from the dark depths below seemed to pulse with an unnatural force, as if something or someone was waiting down there. No one dared venture down the stairs. Instead, they barricaded themselves inside the living room, hoping the night would pass without incident. But the house wasn't done with them yet. One by one, the friends began hearing strange noises, scratching at the doors, thumps on the walls, and the unsettling sound of footsteps creeping across the floor. Desperately trying to rationalize what was happening, they turned on the lights and tried to make sense of it all. That's when they noticed it. The photographs, the ones from the boathouse, had somehow made their way into the living room, now resting on the mantel. But now, the faces of the people in the photos weren't just scratched out. They had been replaced with dark, twisted smudges that looked almost alive. The last straw came when one of them, Ryan, decided to leave the house and get help. He grabbed his keys and made a break for it, running toward the car parked by the lake. But as soon as he stepped outside, something unexplainable happened. The door slammed shut behind him, and the entire house seemed to shift. The once calm lake now looked ominous, the water rippling and churning as if it were alive. Ryan made it to the car, but as he started the engine, it sputtered and died. In a panic, he looked up to see a figure standing at the edge of the water. A dark, hulking shape that moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking in grotesque, inhuman motions. It was impossible to tell if it was human or something else entirely. He slammed the door shut, heart pounding in his chest, and desperately tried to start the car again. But the figure was closer now. It was only when it reached the car and pressed its hand against the window that Ryan saw the face. It was a face he recognized. It was one of his friends, someone who had been with him just hours ago. But this version was different, twisted, pale, and with eyes black as night. And the worst part, the figure was grinning. The next morning, the group found Ryan's car by the side of the lake, doors ajar, but Ryan was gone. His friends searched for hours, calling his name, but the woods swallowed his voice. The only thing they found were the photos, now soaked and disintegrating, scattered all around the lake. And at the very edge of the water, they saw it. A pale hand, barely visible beneath the surface, reaching out to them. The group fled the lake house, never to return. But no matter how far they ran, the memory of what they experienced haunted them. They say the lake house is still there, sitting by the water, waiting for the next visitors. And when the wind is just right, you can hear the whispers calling, urging you to stay just a little longer.
Story number 2.
There are places in the world where the land itself seems to pulse with dark energy, where something ancient and malevolent lurks just beneath the surface. The next story comes from one such place, where a family's attempt at a peaceful vacation quickly descended into a nightmare. A couple, Mark and Emily, had rented a secluded cabin in the mountains for a quiet weekend getaway. It was the kind of place you'd see in a postcard. A small wooden cabin surrounded by towering trees, with a lake shimmering in the distance. The isolation was exactly what they wanted. No distractions, no people, just each other and nature. But as soon as they arrived, something felt off. The cabin itself was quaint but weathered, and when they entered, they immediately noticed how cold it was, despite the warm weather outside. The firewood was piled high in the corner, but there was a strange smell in the air, like damp earth and something else, something rotten. They shrugged it off, thinking it was just the smell of the old wood, and got to work settling in. The first evening passed without incident, aside from Emily mentioning offhandedly that she had a strange feeling, as if they were being watched. Mark laughed it off, suggesting it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. But as the sun set and the night settled in, things began to shift. It started with soft tapping sounds on the window. At first, they assumed it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but the tapping grew more insistent, like someone was lightly knocking, trying to get their attention. Mark went to the window and looked outside, but there was nothing, just the thick forest, stretching out into the darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though, like the forest itself was watching them. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped. Emily lit the fireplace, and they curled up together, trying to ignore the unease that clung to the air. That was when they heard the voices, low, unintelligible murmurs coming from somewhere just outside the cabin. It sounded like whispers, but distorted, like someone was speaking underwater. They both froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, and then they heard something far worse, scratching. It was a slow, deliberate scraping coming from the door. Mark hesitated, then slowly got up to check. He opened the door, but there was nothing there, only the cold, still night air. That's when Emily screamed. Mark turned, heart racing, to see her standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the floor. At first, he thought she had seen something outside the window, but when he followed her gaze, he saw it. Written in the dust on the floor, slowly forming as if it were being drawn by an unseen hand, were the words, "Leave now." Mark's blood ran cold. He tried to brush it off, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. It felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with a presence, something ancient, something hungry. The whispers continued, now a chorus of voices, all speaking in that unintelligible language, rising to a crescendo. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the house seemed to shake. The walls creaked, and the temperature dropped even further. Mark grabbed Emily, and they rushed to the door. But as he turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was sealed shut. Panic set in as the scratching at the walls grew louder, now coming from every direction. The voices became clearer, their language shifting to something familiar, their names. Over and over, they heard their names being whispered, followed by guttural laughter. Mark, Emily, and then the shadow appeared. It was tall, impossibly tall, standing just outside the window. Its shape was indistinct, a shifting silhouette of darkness, but the eyes, those eyes, pierced through the darkness like glowing embers. It grinned, showing rows of jagged teeth, its mouth stretching impossibly wide. The creature tapped on the window with long, clawed fingers, then began to move closer, its distorted form floating as it passed through the walls. Mark and Emily backed away, but no matter where they moved, the creature followed, its grinning face never leaving their sight. They heard the sound of heavy footsteps, growing closer, the air growing thicker. The whispers grew louder, a maddening chorus now, urging them to look at the creature. They tried to run, but their legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air in the cabin had become thick, suffocating, pressing in on them. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The creature disappeared. The whispers faded into silence, and the temperature began to rise again. Mark and Emily, hearts pounding, rushed to the door, and this time it opened. They ran outside, not stopping until they reached their car. Without a word, they drove away, never looking back at the cabin in the woods. Years later, the cabin was found abandoned, its door wide open. The dust and debris still settled in the same places. The townspeople told stories of strange occurrences, people who had ventured near the cabin only to hear whispers and feel the presence of something watching them. Some claimed to have seen the creature themselves, lurking at the edge of the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to wander too close. No one had ever seen Mark or Emily again. The next story comes from a place even darker, one that still haunts the souls of those who dare speak of it. It's the tale of an old forsaken hospital deep in the countryside, long abandoned, but not quite empty. The few who have ventured into its dark halls claim they never leave the same. It was a group of 4 friends, Jack, Lisa, Tom, and Rachel, who had heard the rumors about the old psychiatric hospital, stories of patients who had vanished without a trace, of experiments conducted in secret, and of the twisted things that still lurked within. They were thrill seekers, the kind who enjoyed the rush of fear, and they weren't afraid of ghost stories. They set out to explore, with cameras and flashlights, eager to document their adventure. As they entered the building, the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like they were walking through a fog of dread. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floors creaked with every step. It wasn't just the decay of time they noticed. There was something else, something more sinister in the air. They started in the basement, the coldest and most oppressive part of the hospital. The sound of dripping water echoed through the halls, and they could hear the soft shuffle of their footsteps as they explored the dark rooms. As they turned a corner, they came across a hallway that stretched far beyond what the building's blueprint should have allowed. And then they found it. A door, old and rusted, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The moment they touched the handle, the temperature plummeted. They opened the door to find a room, small and confined, with a single bed at its center, strapped down with old leather restraints. But it wasn't the room that terrified them. It was the walls. The walls were covered in drawings, scratches, scrawled symbols, incoherent words, all carved into the stone as if someone had desperately tried to leave a message. As Lisa examined one of the symbols, she heard a soft whisper in her ear. "Get out!" She spun around, but no one was there. That's when the door slammed shut. The room became suffocatingly cold, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Tom screamed as something invisible grabbed him, dragging him toward the bed. The others tried to pull him back, but their hands passed through him, like he wasn't even there. The last thing they saw was Tom's terrified face, his mouth moving as if to scream, but no sound came out. Then the shadows took him. The group fled, but they were never the same. The nightmares began as soon as they returned home. Whispers in the dark, shadows following them, the images of those eerie symbols etched into their minds. And to this day, no one knows what happened to Tom. They say the hospital is still there, waiting for those brave enough to find it. But those who do rarely come back, and if they do, they're not the same. Something in that place twists you, drags you into its depths, and leaves you forever changed.
Story number 3.
There are some places where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than others, and sometimes that veil is torn open by something that should never have been disturbed. This next story takes us to one such place, an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. Years ago, there had been rumors about the old farmhouse. People spoke in hushed tones about the land being cursed, about the tragic family that once lived there. But over time, the stories faded into whispers, and the farmhouse was abandoned, left to rot in the wilderness. It was a place no one dared visit, but that didn't stop a group of college friends from seeking it out. Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Emily were thrill seekers, always chasing the next adrenaline rush. So, when they heard about the farmhouse, they decided to make a weekend trip out of it. They piled into Mike's truck and drove into the hills, following a narrow, winding road that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the woods. The closer they got, the more the air felt thick and oppressive. They joked about it at first, laughing off the strange feeling that seemed to settle in their chests as they reached the clearing where the farmhouse stood. The house was more dilapidated than they expected. Windows shattered, roof caved in, and the walls covered in layers of grime. It was clear no one had lived there for years. As they stepped inside, the wooden floors groaned under their weight, and the smell of rot and mold filled their noses. But what truly unsettled them was the quiet. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if it were waiting for something to happen. The group set up their things in the living room, unsure of how to begin exploring. That was when they noticed it: scratches. Long, deep gouges in the wooden floorboards, like something had been dragged across them. There were no marks on the walls or the ceiling, just the floor. Sarah knelt down, tracing her fingers along the grooves. They looked fresh, as if they had been made just recently. "Maybe some animals got inside," Mike said, trying to sound nonchalant, but even he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. They decided to stay the night anyway, determined to get a good story out of it. As night fell, they lit candles and set up a fire in the hearth. The wind howled outside, rattling the broken windows. But inside, they felt a strange warmth, a sense of comfort in the face of the creeping dread that seemed to be growing stronger. That was when the noises started. At first, it was just the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, slow and deliberate. Jake and Mike joked that it was just the house settling, but Sarah and Emily were less convinced. The sound seemed to come from the attic, though no one had ventured up there yet. The air grew colder as the dragging noises continued, punctuated by low, guttural murmurs. They were coming from upstairs now, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. Emily volunteered to check it out, eager to prove there was nothing to fear. As she climbed the rickety stairs, she hesitated at the top, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The door to the attic was barely hanging on its hinges, creaking as she pushed it open. There was nothing there at first, just dust and cobwebs. But as she stepped inside, she noticed something strange: old photographs scattered across the floor. They were yellowed and brittle, faces twisted in eerie, unnatural smiles. But it was the last photograph that caught her attention. It was of a woman standing in the doorway of the farmhouse, but her face was distorted, blurred, as though the image had been smeared. Emily picked it up, her hands trembling. She turned the photo over and gasped. On the back was a single word: leave. She dropped the photo, her pulse racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The dragging noises had stopped, but the air was thick with an oppressive presence, a feeling that they were being watched. When she returned downstairs, she was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now," she said, her voice shaking. Mike laughed it off, but the others weren't so sure. They packed their things, but as they moved to leave, the door wouldn't open. The handle jiggled in their hands, but the door refused to budge. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and clearer until it was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. Some of the voices were soft and pleading, others were angry, filled with rage. "Leave! Get out! You're ours!" The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, and the temperature dropped drastically. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, heavy, dragging footsteps, as though something or someone was moving toward them. They tried to break the window to escape, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was as if the house itself was holding them inside. Then they saw it. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her long hair hanging in matted clumps over her face. She stood motionless, staring down at them, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and as she moved toward them, her body contorted in unnatural ways, bending and twisting with sickening cracks. The group backed away, but the woman was already at the bottom of the stairs. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with guttural growls, as though the house itself was alive with malice. The temperature continued to drop, their breath visible in the freezing air. Mike rushed to the door, desperately pulling at the handle, but it was no use. The woman was now standing in front of them, her mouth opening wider and wider, as if to swallow them whole. A horrible low scream filled the room, echoing off the walls, vibrating the very foundation of the house. And then in an instant, they were gone. The house was silent again. When the authorities arrived days later, they found the farmhouse abandoned once more. There was no sign of the four friends, no footprints, no belongings, not even a trace that they had ever been there. The only thing left was the photograph of the woman in the attic, her distorted face staring back at them with empty, hollow eyes. No one ever dared to return to that farmhouse. But some say that if you stand outside at night, you can still hear the whispers calling from within. Another haunting tale comes from a place much closer to home, the kind of place where you might least expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. But it's often those places that hold the most terrible secrets. A man named Richard had always been skeptical of ghost stories. He had never believed in the supernatural, dismissing it as mere fantasy. But that all changed when he moved into his new apartment, a modest place on the third floor of an old building in the city. At first, everything seemed fine. The apartment was small but cozy, and Richard enjoyed the peace and quiet of the building. But after a few weeks, he began to notice strange things happening. It started with the lights flickering. At first, he thought it was just a faulty electrical system, but the flickering became more frequent. Then there were the footsteps. Late at night, when everything was still, Richard would hear the sound of footsteps above him, heavy and slow, as though someone were pacing back and forth. He'd get up to check, but no one was ever there. The footsteps continued, though, growing louder and more insistent. Sometimes they would pause right above his bed, and Richard would lie there, wide awake, too terrified to move. Then, one night, he heard something else. A voice. A soft whisper coming from the corner of the room. He strained to listen, his heart racing, but the voice was too faint to understand. He moved toward the source, but as he stepped closer, the voice stopped. The silence was unbearable. The next day, Richard decided to investigate. He knocked on the door of the apartment above his, but no one answered. The building's manager told him that the apartment had been vacant for months, and the previous tenant had left abruptly without any explanation. That night, as Richard lay in bed, the footsteps returned, but this time they were different. They were coming down the stairs, slowly, methodically. Each step echoed in the silence, growing louder with every passing moment. And then, just as they reached the bottom, the door to his apartment creaked open. Richard was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. He heard the soft shuffle of footsteps entering his room, and then the sound of something, or someone, breathing heavily, standing just beside his bed. The last thing Richard ever saw was the shadow of a figure, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. And then there was nothing but darkness.
Story number 4.
Some places are so steeped in darkness that the very air seems to carry the weight of the horrors that have transpired there. The next story comes from a town forgotten by time, where the streets are empty and the houses are left to decay. A young couple, Karen and David, were road tripping through the countryside when they stumbled upon a small town that wasn't on any map. The faded road signs, the decaying buildings, and the eerie silence that hung over the town struck them as odd, but not enough to turn back. They thought it would be a quaint place to rest for the night. The sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Black Hollow," but there was no welcoming charm in the name. Still, they continued driving, looking for a place to stay. The first building they came across was a rundown inn, its windows cracked and the door hanging off its hinges. The neon sign flickered dimly, but there was something inviting about it. A place for the night, they thought. They knocked on the door, and an old woman, bent with age, answered. Her smile was thin, her eyes sharp as she took them in. "You'll find rooms upstairs," she said, voice raspy, as though she hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "But be careful. You don't want to stay too long, not here." David laughed nervously, brushing off her warning. It seemed like typical old lady superstition. They paid for the room, thanked her, and went up the creaking stairs. The room was sparse, a bed, a table, a single flickering lamp. It was nothing special, but it felt off. The air was thick, the silence deafening. As Karen unpacked their bags, she noticed something strange, a portrait hanging on the wall. It was a painting of a woman with wild, hollow eyes, her face twisted in a grin that sent shivers down Karen's spine. She felt like the woman in the painting was watching her, and every time she looked away, her eyes seemed to follow. As night fell, they tried to relax, but something wasn't right. The town was too quiet. Not a single dog barked, no distant hum of traffic, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as though the entire world had stopped. Karen tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, like someone walking slowly and deliberately toward their room. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew closer and the air grew colder. David, half asleep, heard it too. He got up, checked the hallway, but saw nothing. There was only the oppressive silence. He returned to bed, but neither of them could shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The footsteps came again, louder this time, and then the whispering started. Karen sat up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers were soft at first, unintelligible, like voices from the past, but they were coming from the wall. A strange, eerie scraping sound followed, like nails dragging across the wood. She stood up, moved closer to the wall, and pressed her ear against it, but all she could hear was her own breath, shallow and rapid. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open. No one was there. David rushed over, but he froze in place, his eyes widening with terror. The old woman stood at the doorway, her face twisted in an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have stayed," she whispered, her voice low and menacing. "Now you'll see." And just like that, the room plunged into darkness. The flickering lamp died, and the oppressive silence returned. David and Karen were left in the pitch black, unable to see anything but the cold darkness around them. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and then they heard it, scraping like claws against wood, only this time it was coming from beneath the floorboards. Panic set in as they tried to find their way to the door, but the air was thick, suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in. Then something moved in the dark. A figure, long and thin, its body twisted in unnatural ways, crawling toward them on all fours. Its eyes were hollow, empty, and it grinned as it drew closer, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. The couple screamed, desperately trying to escape. But when they reached the door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked them back. They turned, only to see the figure standing at the foot of the bed, its smile widening. The last thing Karen saw was the figure's eyes, black as coal, filled with a malevolent hunger, and then nothing but darkness. The next morning, the inn was empty. The old woman was gone, as were the couple. No one in the town spoke of them again, but the whispers in the town continued. And if you listen closely, you might hear footsteps in the night, slow and deliberate, moving towards you. Another story comes from a small village deep in the forest, hidden from the world by a veil of mist and superstition. It was a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were said to be especially thin. A man named Alan, a skeptic at heart, had heard the stories of this village and decided to investigate. He was a journalist, always looking for the next big story, and when he heard of strange occurrences in the village, he saw it as an opportunity to make a name for himself. The villagers spoke of a curse, one that had haunted the area for centuries. They told him of a long-abandoned cemetery just outside the village, where the dead were said to rise at night and wander the grounds. Alan scoffed at the superstition, convinced that it was all folklore. He set out one evening, determined to see the cemetery for himself. As he approached, the air grew cold and the mist seemed to thicken. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, like the earth itself was alive, and the trees loomed over him, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The cemetery was as desolate as the villagers had described it. The gravestones were old, some broken, others half buried beneath the earth. But there was something else, a dark, oppressive presence that filled the air. Alan snapped photos, scribbled notes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. As night began to fall, Alan made his way toward the old chapel at the far end of the cemetery. The doors creaked as he pushed them open, revealing an altar covered in dust. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly he heard it, the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, but there was no one there. The sound of breathing, slow and ragged, echoed through the chapel. Alan's heart pounded in his chest as he backed toward the door. And then he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, shapeless, indistinct, but moving toward him. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty sockets, and their mouths opened in silent screams. Alan tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling him down. The figures advanced, their steps slow and deliberate, and the whispers grew louder, filled with anguish. "Join us!" Alan screamed, but the words were swallowed by the night. The last thing he felt was cold, then nothing at all. When the villagers went to check the cemetery the next morning, all that remained of Alan was his camera, its lens cracked, and the last photo he had taken of a face, pale and hollow, staring back at him.
Story number 5.
Some stories are so terrifying, they can linger in your mind for years, echoing in your thoughts long after you've heard them. The next story takes us to a place where the walls breathe and the floorboards seem to have memories of their own. A place where every step you take feels like an invitation for something to follow you. A family of 4, Eric, his wife Laura, and their 2 children, Sophie and Ben, decided to take a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. They found a secluded house in the mountains, nestled between dense trees and isolated from the outside world. The pictures of the house online looked perfect, rustic, charming, and cozy. The owner, an older woman named Mrs. Hale, had promised them a peaceful getaway, far from the noise and distractions of the modern world. The family was thrilled by the idea of spending a week in a place that promised tranquility. When they arrived, the house was exactly as the photos had shown, old but well kept. The wooden floors creaked with age, and the walls had an antique charm. But there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken history. The house, though beautiful, felt as if it were holding something back, as if it were hiding something in its crevices. Mrs. Hale was nowhere to be found when they arrived, but they didn't think much of it. She had left a key under the doormat with a note saying she'd be back later. The first couple of days were fine. The family enjoyed hiking, playing games by the fireplace, and exploring the woods around the house. But as night fell, things started to take a strange turn. Sophie, the youngest, began having trouble sleeping. She claimed to hear whispers in the walls. At first, Eric and Laura brushed it off as her imagination, but the longer they stayed, the more unsettling her claims became. One evening, while the family was gathered in the living room, Sophie stood up and began staring at the corner of the room. She was silent, her eyes wide with fear. "They're watching," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They want us to leave." Laura laughed nervously, but Eric felt a chill creep down his spine. The room had grown colder. Sophie's gaze was fixed on the corner, as though something or someone was standing there, just out of sight. Laura followed Sophie's stare, but saw nothing. The next night, things got worse. Sophie woke up in the middle of the night screaming. Eric and Laura rushed to her side, only to find her standing at the foot of their bed, her eyes wide with terror. She was mumbling incoherently, as though she were speaking to someone who wasn't there. "Please don't hurt me," she cried, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to go back." Ben, her older brother, had also been acting strangely. He was often found staring at the walls, his face pale, as though he were lost in thought, or perhaps under the influence of something. He spoke of shadows in the corners of the house, watching him when he was alone. The parents dismissed it as fear or the result of too much imagination, but deep down, they knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before Eric began to experience odd occurrences himself. One evening, while exploring the attic, he found an old chest hidden behind a pile of forgotten furniture. Inside the chest were yellowed photographs, faded and torn with age. Some were of families, some of people Eric didn't recognize, and others were of the house itself, back when it had been newly built. One photo in particular caught his attention. A picture of a smiling family standing in front of the house, but there was something horribly wrong about it. The father in the picture had eyes that were completely black, his smile twisted and unnatural. It was the same smile Eric had seen in his own reflection earlier that day, just for a split second, when he looked into the mirror. He hurriedly closed the chest and made his way back downstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following him. Every time he turned around, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the house deeper, more oppressive. Then things began to escalate. One night, as the family sat around the dinner table, the lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed from the basement. Eric stood up to investigate. But when he opened the basement door, he was hit with a wave of foul air, as if something had been trapped down there for years. His heart raced as he descended the stairs, his flashlight flickering in the dark. At the bottom of the stairs, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A row of old wooden chairs, each one turned toward a wall, as though someone had been sitting there for years, staring at the blank space. As Eric approached, he could hear faint whispers, like 1,000 voices talking in unison. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. A reflection in the corner of the room, a face, looking back at him. It was the same black-eyed man from the photograph. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and the room went deathly silent. Eric spun around, but no one was there. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. His hands shook as he locked it. "Laura," he yelled, his voice cracking. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The house had already started to change. From that moment on, the family couldn't escape the presence that lurked within the walls. The shadows grew longer, the whispers louder, and the figure that had been haunting Eric's reflection began to appear in the mirrors, in the windows, and even in their dreams. Sophie and Ben stopped speaking altogether. Their eyes glazed and hollow, as though they had seen something that had broken them. The house seemed to breathe, to grow alive in its own right, its very foundations shifting, expanding, reaching out to consume them. And no matter how hard they tried to escape, the door remained locked. The windows sealed shut. The house was keeping them inside. The last time anyone saw them, they were standing at the window, staring out into the night, their eyes wide and empty. When the authorities arrived days later, they found nothing. No sign of the family, no traces of where they'd gone. Only the house remained, its walls silent, its windows staring blankly into the forest. But on quiet nights when the wind howls through the trees, some claim they can still hear the whispers from inside the house. If you listen closely enough, you can hear the family, trapped in the house forever, their voices faint and desperate, begging to be let out.
Story number 6.
There are places where time seems to stand still, where something ancient and malevolent has waited for centuries to be disturbed. The next story comes from such a place, where even the bravest souls who wander near the ruins find themselves changed forever, if they escape at all. It was a warm summer afternoon when Matt, a young photographer with a thirst for adventure, decided to explore an old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of a small town. The mansion had been empty for decades, its once grand structure now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who would listen to stay away from the place. They said it was cursed, that the mansion had been the site of unspeakable horrors in the past. But to Matt, this only made it more intriguing. With his camera in hand, he set off toward the mansion, eager to capture its eerie beauty on film. The sun had begun to set by the time he arrived, casting long shadows across the decaying building. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot, and the windows were dark, the glass shattered or boarded up. But Matt wasn't deterred. He'd been to dozens of abandoned places, and none had ever made him feel this way before. Something in the air here was different, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Matt pushed open the rusted gates, which groaned in protest, and made his way toward the front door. It creaked as he entered, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The mansion was like a tomb, still and silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent a chill down his spine. Matt explored room after room, taking photos of the peeling wallpaper, the rotting furniture, the faded portraits of long-dead inhabitants staring out at him with lifeless eyes. As he ventured deeper into the house, Matt began to notice something strange. In every room, there were symbols carved into the walls, strange, twisted shapes that looked almost like runes. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the air grew colder the closer he got to them. He took a few shots, hoping the photos would capture the strange energy he was feeling, but the camera's flash seemed to flicker strangely whenever it pointed toward the carvings. Finally, Matt found his way to the basement door, a heavy wooden thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The handle was rusted, and it took all his strength to pull it open. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, but he descended into the darkness anyway. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt dense, as if it were pressing in on him. At the bottom of the stairs, Matt found something that made his blood run cold. The floor was covered in dust and old, rotting wood, but in the center of the room was an altar, a stone slab with chains hanging from the ceiling above it. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, but these ones were different, darker, more complex, and far more ominous. He moved closer to inspect the altar, but as he did, something caught his eye. In the corner of the room, a dark shape seemed to shift, a presence that wasn't quite there, but seemed to surround him nonetheless. He spun around, but the room was empty, and that's when he heard it. A whisper, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. The voice seemed to come from all around him, filling his ears with words he couldn't understand, a language that twisted his mind in a way he couldn't explain. His pulse quickened, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The room grew colder, the air thick with a pressure he couldn't escape. The shadows around him seemed to grow longer, darker, until they were stretching toward him, as though they had a life of their own. Matt backed away, but the shadows followed, closing in around him. The whispers became louder, more frantic, and then, with a horrible guttural noise, the darkness erupted. Matt found himself falling, tumbling through the shadows, but instead of hitting the ground, he felt like he was sinking into the very fabric of the house. His skin felt like it was being scraped off, and the coldness was unbearable. For a moment, he thought he would suffocate, but then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The whispers went silent, and the shadows receded. He was no longer in the basement. Instead, he stood in a small, dimly lit room, much smaller than any room in the mansion. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the air smelled of incense and something ancient, something that didn't belong. The room was empty except for a single figure standing in the center, facing away from him. The figure turned slowly, and Matt's heart nearly stopped. It was himself. The figure's face was pale, its eyes wide and empty, and a cruel smile twisted its lips. The figure raised a hand toward Matt, its fingers long and twisted like claws. As it did, Matt felt his chest tighten, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Welcome home," the figure whispered, its voice a twisted version of his own. "You've been expected." Matt reached for his camera in a frantic attempt to escape, but his hands were shaking too much. The figure stepped closer, and Matt could hear it breathing, slow, deliberate breaths that echoed in the silence. "No one leaves," the figure hissed. "You've seen too much." Suddenly, everything went black. When the authorities found Matt's camera days later, abandoned in the middle of the mansion's basement, the only photo on the film was of the altar. But there, in the center of the shot, was something that shouldn't have been there, something that looked like a dark, twisted shadow reaching toward the camera. No one has ever seen Matt again, but the mansion still stands, decaying in the mountains, and the whispers that echo through the halls grow louder with each passing year. Another chilling story comes from an even darker place, the forgotten corners of an old town, where the memories of the past cling like cobwebs to the buildings and the land itself. A young woman named Lila had always been fascinated by the old abandoned hotel at the edge of town. It had been closed for years, its windows boarded up, and its once vibrant sign faded and cracked. The locals spoke of it in whispers, but no one would ever dare go near it. They said it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died there long ago. But Leela, ever the skeptic, didn't believe in ghosts. She thought it was just superstition, an old story designed to keep people away. One rainy evening, she decided to visit the hotel. She slipped inside through a broken window, her flashlight illuminating the decaying interior. The furniture was covered in dust, the air musty with mildew. She snapped pictures of the decrepit rooms, intrigued by the eerie beauty of the place. But as she moved deeper into the hotel, she felt something change. The temperature dropped, and the silence grew suffocating, like a presence was watching her every move. In the hallway, she saw a door slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, but as her flashlight flickered, she saw something that made her heart race: a mirror, covered in grime and cracked with age. But it wasn't the mirror that unsettled her. It was the reflection she saw. It wasn't her own. A pale figure stood behind her in the mirror, its face gaunt and twisted in a grotesque smile. Lila spun around, but no one was there. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay. The whispering began, soft at first, then growing louder until it seemed to fill the entire room. She turned back to the mirror, but now the figure was closer, its hollow eyes fixed on her. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Lila's scream echoed through the empty halls as the shadows in the room seemed to shift and close in around her. They found her body the next day, face down in the dust, her eyes wide open in terror, her camera still clutched in her hand. The lens was cracked, but the last image on the film was of the mirror, broken, but with the figure still standing there, its smile now twisted into something even more horrific. No one dared go near the hotel again, and it was eventually forgotten. But those who live nearby say they can still hear whispers on stormy nights, the whispers of the lost souls trapped within the walls of that cursed hotel. And some claim that if you stand in front of the hotel on a quiet evening, you might catch a glimpse of a face in the window. A face with hollow eyes, watching.
Story number 7.
There are places in this world where time itself seems to warp, and the air grows thick with a presence you can't escape. The following story comes from a town lost to history, a town where those who wander into it are never seen again. It started when a man named Paul, a seasoned traveler and amateur historian, discovered an old map in an antique shop in the heart of the city. The map, worn and yellowed with age, seemed to mark a location far off the beaten path, an isolated village deep in the mountains, a place not listed on any modern map. The shopkeeper had warned Paul that the village was off limits, but it was too late. Paul's curiosity was piqued, and he couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. He gathered supplies and set out the very next day, determined to find the village and uncover whatever secrets lay hidden within its long-forgotten streets. As he journeyed deeper into the mountains, the weather turned colder and the path grew narrower. Soon, even the birds had stopped singing, and the wind itself seemed to hold a deep, ominous silence. When he finally arrived at the village, it was like stepping into a different era. The buildings were old, the streets overgrown with ivy and moss, and an unsettling stillness hung in the air. The houses were eerily well preserved, yet empty. No people, no sounds, only the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Paul wandered through the village, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestone streets. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him from behind the curtains of the houses. He took out his camera, snapping photos of the dilapidated homes and overgrown gardens. But every time he pointed the lens at a building, the camera seemed to flicker, as though the light itself was resisting his attempts to capture the moment. It wasn't until the sun began to set that Paul stumbled upon something that stopped him cold: a massive stone archway, covered in vines, leading to a large cemetery at the edge of the village. The tombstones were weathered, some cracked in half, others tipped over, but what truly caught his attention were the inscriptions on the stones. The names were familiar, too familiar. There, etched in the stone, were the names of people Paul knew, family members, friends, and even his own name, among others. Some of the dates were from the distant past, while others were only a few years old. Confused and shaken, Paul began to back away, but that's when he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heart began to race. He turned back to the cemetery, his eyes scanning the gravestones. As he did, a shadow flitted across the ground, moving just outside the corner of his vision. When he looked again, a figure stood at the far end of the cemetery, partially obscured by a large tombstone. The figure was tall, draped in tattered clothing that seemed to shift and ripple like a dark cloud, and its face was obscured by a hood. But as Paul's eyes locked on the figure, he felt a cold chill run through him, and he realized that this was no ordinary person. The figure was still unmoving, but Paul could feel its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. "Who are you?" Paul called out, his voice shaky. There was no response. With his heart pounding, Paul backed away, but before he could turn to run, the figure stepped forward, its movement impossibly fast, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. A whisper filled the air, low and raspy, like a voice from deep underground. "Leave now, or you will stay forever." The words hung in the air as if they were alive, vibrating with an unnatural force. Paul turned and ran, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, the sound of his own breath echoing in his ears. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the figure chasing him, closing in. He reached the village's outskirts, the archway just ahead, but when he stepped through it, everything changed. The village was no longer as he had seen it. Now it was a dark, twisted version of itself. The buildings crooked and broken, the streets lined with shadows. The sun was gone, and a thick fog had rolled in, choking the air. Panicked, Paul ran faster, but it was as if the village itself was alive, shifting and warping, trapping him. He could hear the whispers again, growing louder, until they were all around him, suffocating him. And then the figure appeared once more, this time standing in front of him, its hooded face now visible, its eyes black holes that seemed to swallow the light. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "This place is not for the living." In a final desperate attempt to escape, Paul turned and ran straight into the fog, not daring to look back. The whispers grew louder, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling at his feet, trying to drag him down. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the presence that seemed to chase him. When they found him days later, Paul's body was discovered at the edge of the village, his eyes wide open, his mouth frozen in a scream. His camera was missing, but in the dirt, there were strange symbols etched into the ground, similar to the ones he had seen in the cemetery. No one knows what happened to Paul after that day. Some say he is still lost in the village, trapped in the fog. Others claim the village never truly existed outside of his mind. But there are those who still hear the whispers on the wind, and they warn travelers to stay far away from that place. Because in that village, the past and the present are bound together, and once you enter, you may never leave. Another unsettling tale comes from the remote coastline of a small town, where the cliffs are jagged and the ocean's waves crash relentlessly against the rocks. The town is known for its lighthouse, which stands tall on a solitary cliff. The lighthouse hasn't been operational for decades, but some say it still casts a beam of light out over the ocean at night. A couple, Rachel and James, decided to take a vacation in this quiet coastal town, hoping for a peaceful retreat away from the noise of city life. The local innkeeper warned them not to wander too close to the lighthouse, telling them a story of a tragedy that had occurred there long ago. But Rachel and James, drawn by curiosity, ignored the warning. That night, they decided to explore the lighthouse, despite the town's ominous warnings. The air was heavy with mist as they climbed the narrow, winding path up the cliffside. The lighthouse loomed above them, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. As they approached the door, Rachel felt a strange coldness radiating from within, but she brushed it off as a chill from the sea. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of salt and decay hung heavily in the air. The walls were lined with old photographs and nautical maps, and the rusty machinery at the base of the lighthouse stood frozen in time. But as they ventured up the creaking staircase, the atmosphere grew darker, more oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse as though the building was alive. When they reached the top, they found the lantern room empty, except for one thing. The large lens, which was meant to focus the light, was still shining. It was as if the lighthouse was still trying to cast its light out over the ocean. Rachel moved closer to inspect it, but when she looked into the glass, her heart skipped a beat. In the reflection, she saw a man standing behind them. She spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and the beam of light flickered. James stepped back, his face pale. "Let's go," he said, his voice trembling. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut. They were trapped. A voice echoed from the shadows, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You shouldn't have come." The lighthouse began to shake, the floor beneath them vibrating as though something was trying to break through. The light flickered again, and then for a brief moment, it illuminated a figure in the doorway, a tall man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The last thing Rachel and James saw was that smile, and then the light went out. The lighthouse stood silent once more, and the town would never speak of the couple again. But the lighthouse still casts its light over the ocean, and sometimes on stormy nights you can hear whispers carried on the wind, warning you not to get too close.
Story number 8.
There are stories that should never be told, secrets hidden away, too dangerous to reveal. These are the kinds of stories that start innocently enough, but leave you questioning the boundaries of reality itself. This is one of those stories, a warning for anyone who dares venture into the unknown. It started with a seemingly harmless visit to a small, secluded cabin nestled in the woods. Emma, a young woman in her 20s, had always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of the city. When she came across an ad for a charming little cabin in the woods available for rent, she jumped at the opportunity. It promised a peaceful getaway, an escape from the noise, the chaos, and the constant distractions of her everyday life. The cabin was exactly as described, rustic, with a crackling fireplace and views of towering trees stretching far into the distance. The air smelled fresh, the quiet was almost deafening, and for the first few days, everything felt perfect. Emma spent her time hiking, reading, and enjoying the solitude. It felt like paradise, until the night the nightmares started. At first, it was small things. A creaking floorboard in the dead of night, the flickering of the candle she had left burning on the kitchen counter, the feeling of being watched when she was sure no one was around. She dismissed it all as her imagination running wild. But then, things escalated. One evening, as Emma sat on the porch overlooking the woods, she heard something faint in the distance. It was hard to describe, like a whisper carried on the wind, but there was no one around. She strained her ears, but the sound stopped as soon as she focused on it. Shaking her head, she tried to laugh it off, but then, as she stood up to go inside, she caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. At first, she thought it was an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a squirrel, but as she focused, her blood ran cold. There, between the trees, stood a figure, a man dressed in old, tattered clothing with dark eyes that seemed to glow in the moonlight. He didn't move, didn't blink. He simply stared at her, his gaze unblinking, unyielding. Emma felt her heart race in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She backed slowly toward the cabin, but before she could retreat inside, the figure was gone, vanished without a trace. The next day, Emma went into town to pick up supplies, her nerves frayed. She mentioned the figure to the local storekeeper, an old woman who looked at her with wide, knowing eyes. "You shouldn't have gone there," the woman said, her voice low. "That cabin, it has a history. People who go there, they don't always come back the same." Emma tried to brush it off as local superstition, but as the days passed, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. That night, as she sat in the cabin alone, the whispers returned, but this time they weren't just distant, they came from inside the house. At first, it was just a soft rustling of voices, barely audible, but then the whispers grew louder. They began to form words, words she couldn't understand, a language that was foreign, ancient, and disturbing. Emma clutched her head, her pulse pounding in her ears as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The whispers turned into laughter, a deep, guttural sound, like something that had been buried for centuries, just waiting to break free. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness. The air grew cold, and the temperature seemed to drop rapidly. Then, the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. Emma screamed, scrambling for the door, but before she could reach it, something unseen grabbed her, pulling her back into the center of the room. She fought with everything she had, but the grip was unrelenting. The whispers swirled around her, louder, angrier, like an unseen force tormenting her mind. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, it stopped. The room fell silent. Emma lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her hands shaking. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she looked around the cabin. Nothing had changed, but she knew something was terribly wrong. The next day, Emma packed her things and left without a second thought. She didn't want to stay another minute in that cursed cabin. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, something that had followed her from the woods. As she made her way down the winding roads, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a split second, she saw it. Again, the figure, standing by the side of the road, watching her. His dark eyes never blinked, but this time she didn't stop. She kept driving, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't care where she was going, only that she had to get away. No one knows exactly what happened to Emma after that night. Some say she never made it out of the woods, that she became another lost soul trapped by the cabin's dark power. Others say she returned to the city, but that the terror of the woods never left her. The cabin, however, remains untouched, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander into its grasp. They say that once you step into the cabin's shadow, you can never truly leave. That something lingers there, watching and waiting until it has what it wants, your soul. Another story, equally disturbing, comes from a remote island off the coast of Scotland, known as the Black Isle. Local legends tell of an old manor house that once stood at the edge of the cliffs, abandoned for centuries. It was a place where only the brave or the foolish dared to venture, for it was said that the house was haunted by the spirits of those who had disappeared there, those who were never seen again. A group of friends, eager for a thrill, decided to take a trip to the island. They arrived on a foggy afternoon, the sky a murky gray, with the sound of the waves crashing violently against the cliffs below. The island was barren, with only the remnants of the old manor house remaining. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The friends didn't listen to the warnings of the locals. They ventured inside the manor, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air inside was damp and cold, and the silence was oppressive. As they explored, they found strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. As night fell, the group gathered around the fireplace, telling stories to pass the time. But as the wind howled outside, one of them, David, noticed something strange. Through the shattered windows, he saw figures moving in the distance, figures that seemed to be watching them. At first, they thought it was just the wind, or perhaps their minds playing tricks on them. But when the figures began to draw closer and the whispers started to fill the room, they realized that something was horribly wrong. The house began to shake, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. One by one, the friends started to disappear, vanishing without a trace. Their screams echoed through the house, but no one was there to hear them. The last thing David saw was a shadow crossing the threshold of the door, and then darkness. The next morning, the island was silent again, the fog thickening over the cliffs. When the authorities arrived, they found the manor house, but it was empty. No trace of the friends, no evidence of their disappearance, just the same symbols carved into the walls, as though they had never been there at all. The Black Isle is still there, waiting for the next group of curious souls. And those who dare to venture close enough say that on stormy nights you can hear the whispers of those who went before. Whispers that warn of the horrors that await anyone who dares to enter the house again. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some places better left forgotten.